Hello again. Well, this is our final little piece on the book of Daniel. I don't think this will take more than a few minutes anyway. But what I would like to do is just run a couple of things by you that pertain to what is called the liberal critical view. And what they're arguing, let me demonstrate on our pad here. They're trying to say that instead of a 6th century author, because of how predictive Daniel is, and for some odd reason, naturalism has impacted them to such a degree that they feel like miracle just can't be a plausible explanation. They say Daniel could not have actually written the book bearing his name. And so what had to happen was a 2nd century author during the days of the Maccabees, as we talked about in Daniel 11, Daniel chapter 8, writes all of this backwards. This is known as ex eventu prophecy. The words in Latin meaning after the event. So they're saying that it's written to look like it's prophetic, but it's written by some fake individual who poses as if he were Daniel and acts as if he's writing it all forward. That's their view. Now I want to give you 6 different reasons that they give. These are reasons for viewing it, reasons for the liberal critical view. I want to give you 6 of their reasons and then attempt to give you some alternative options as to why we should reject their view. Number 1, they say that the argument from linguistics, so the languages of Greek and Persian, indicate lateness. Well, that's just simply not a good argument. In fact, S.R. Driver became notorious for arguing that the Greek words in the book of Daniel he said they demand a late authorship. Well, that's very interesting. They're found in chapter 3 only, and all 3 terms are musical terms. So the Greek is just not littered through the book of Daniel. If it were a 2nd century author, we'd almost expect it to be in Greek. It's hardly there at all. These are musical words, and as we pointed out in chapter 3, it's easy for musical words to slip into another language. The Persian, on the other hand, actually argues for an earlier date. This is interesting because when the papyrus was found at Elephantine down in Egypt, the Aramaic language, I put Persian here, I mean Aramaic, you see. The Aramaic language actually reflected an earlier date. So it's earlier than 2nd century. I mean, the language of the Aramaic reflected an earlier date. And Robert Dick Wilson argues this masterfully in his 2 books, Studies in the Book of Daniel, Studies 1 and Studies 2. The second argument they make, this argument fails, is what I mean to say. The second argument is this: Daniel's placement in the Hebrew canon was with the writings, the hagiographa, the word meaning holy writings. He was in the holy writings with the Psalms and the Proverbs and the Song of Solomon and the Ecclesiastes. His book was found in that section rather than the prophets. But I'm not sure what that means. The fact that it's even there and it's there early and the Jews accepted it as canonical says all we really need to say. After all, who cares about whether or not Daniel, even though he claims to be a prophet, was placed in another place? There could be a number of reasons for why that is. I mean, after all, David is called a prophet. David is a prophet. His books aren't placed in the prophetic section of the canon. The placement on the hagiographa just simply doesn't amount to anything. Josephus attested to the earliness of the text, and that's all we really care about. Where it was placed in the Hebrew canon, again, Robert Dick Wilson has done wonderful work demonstrating why that's just a non-issue. Number 3, the book of Ecclesiasticus, chapters 40 through 50 specifically, has what is called a hall of faith, and Daniel is not mentioned. Well, that's just not a problem either. A number of characters from the Old Testament aren't mentioned there. Again, this is a bad argument. This is just a bad argument. The fact that Daniel doesn't find himself in the Ecclesiasticus, Jesus ben Sirach's hall of faith, the fact that Daniel is not in that hall of faith is just inconsequential. A number of characters are not there. And that just doesn't amount to anything other than to say he's just not there. You can't make an argument from silence like that and it really come out to amount to anything. Number 4, the alleged discrepancies. Now, we've talked about all of these, so I'm not going to belabor these at length, but the alleged discrepancies are argued, so say the skeptics, to argue against the 6th century traditional authorship of the book of Daniel. So alleged discrepancies such as the 70 years easily could be a rounded figure. Another alleged discrepancy is the Darius of the book. Well, I think that's Gubaru of the Nabonidus Chronicle, and as of yet, there's nothing that contradicts that. The existence of Belshazzar was an argument that used to be argued. Anymore, it's pretty well conceded that Belshazzar is a legitimate person ever since the discovery of the Nabonidus Chronicle. Then we had the word Chaldean, and the word Chaldean, as we pointed out in chapters 1 and 2, doesn't lend any support either. It was used by Herodotus back close to Daniel's day. Highly possible, and even used earlier in a cast of wise men kind of way. It's used in 2 senses, the first one being in reference just to a nationality and ethnicity, and it's used even in the book of Genesis and Job that way, which is far earlier than Daniel, but it's used in the second way to refer to a specific cast of wise men, and Herodotus used it that way even close to Daniel's day. Highly possible that it's used by the 6th century author Daniel. There's nothing that establishes anything there for the skeptic. Then there was also an alleged discrepancy about Nebuchadnezzar's illness. Lycanthropy, though, seems to be a legitimate situation that would fit quite well. Number 5, then, they give us a 5th reason, and that is based on the apocalyptic content. And they say things like Messiah is a word that didn't appear until 2nd century. Well, that's only true given the assumption that Daniel 9:25 through 27 doesn't use the word Messiah in reference to an anointed king in Israel, in reference to Christ in a predictive kind of way. But if Daniel 9 is 6th century, is it really implausible or impossible that the word Messiah, Messiah in the Hebrew, would be used in reference specifically to the Davidic monarch? I don't think so. You've got notions of a futuristic Davidic king all over the Psalms, all over the prophets, some of them even as early as maybe, let's say 10th century BC. You go back to Genesis 49, even there was a text early, Genesis 49, 8 through 10, that the scepter wouldn't depart from Judah, David's line, until Shiloh comes. Another apocalyptic content is angels. And the argument usually goes, well, angels don't really appear until 2nd century literature. That's as false as it could be. You see them all over the book of Genesis. That's sufficient. Another apocalyptic content, resurrection. They say resurrection wasn't a concept until 2nd century. That's false. We documented that in Isaiah. We documented it in Hosea. We documented it in Ezekiel 37. And then even in the Psalms, like Psalm 16, you've got this notion of resurrection. Early. So all of the things they say here as far as the content goes that should be early, we've at least given an alternative where that's not necessarily demanded by the evidence. And then the last one is not even an argument, it's an assumption, but that is no predictive prophecy. And that is just simply an assumption. If you rule out miracles, well, of course you're going to say there's no such thing as predictive prophecy. But under the Old Testament, it's claimed a number of times. Specifically, one that I'd give is 1 Kings 13, where it names Josiah 200 years in advance. The skeptic wants to say that's ex eventu prophecy. That's an assumption. And it's not going to do to say that this would be the only case. Brevard Childs, professor of Old Testament at Yale, said Daniel's text would be the only case where there would be predictive prophecy. Well, that's under the assumption. That the other cases are ex eventu as well. I mean, this is circular reasoning, you see. So, Isaiah 44 and 45, which names Cyrus by name in advance, they say, well, that's ex eventu. That's an assumption. I'm saying there's predictive prophecy all over the Old Testament. It's littered with it. And I'm saying that to say there's no such thing is an assumption only in the liberal critical vein of things. These 6 arguments don't come close to establishing. the liberal critical view. And what I've done then in the introduction is I've given a serious, credible articulation that the 6th century authorship, I gave, I think, 10 reasons for why a 6th century authorship is to be fully appreciated. It is plausible, it is fitting, and therefore in examining the 6 arguments that they put forth, the liberal critical view puts forth, and how weightless they are, it seems highly plausible that we're dealing with a 6th century author, as claimed by even our Lord Jesus Christ. He said that Daniel wrote the book, Matthew 24 and verse 15. And if there's no other argument, at least we know that our Lord thought Daniel wrote the book. That should settle it for any serious Bible believer. Thank you for joining us in our study of the book of Daniel. If you've got other questions, shoot us an email at drewleonard@live.com. Check out our website, cadleonard.com. You can order the book through there, or you can find it on lulu.com. We've got a couple of books now that are published through Amazon. You might just type in Drew Leonard and see what you come up with. We've got a book, New Heavens and New Earth, that's on Amazon. We've got another book on Christian apologetics called Substantive Faith. We'd love to hear from you. Reach out anytime. Hopefully you have a good rest of your evening. God bless you always, to His glory.